The wind had shifted that morning. It carried the scent of pine and dust, and something else, something tense and unfamiliar. Eliza McBride stood on the porch of her homestead with a bucket of water in one hand and her grey braid pulled over one shoulder. At 48, she had known war, loss, and the kind of loneliness that pressed in around you like silence. Her cabin sat far from town, nestled between low hills and thickets. She liked it that way, quiet, predictable. After her husband died 5 winters ago, she'd made peace with solitude. But the peace shattered when she saw the boy. He lay face down at the edge of her field, tangled in tall grass, his shirt torn and his leg bloodied. His skin was dark, his hair long and matted. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. Lakota. Eliza's heart jumped, but not from fear, from instinct, from a truth she could never ignore. A child in pain was still a child. She dropped the bucket. Within the hour, she had him on her bed, wrapped in one of her wool blankets. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling in Lakota. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Fear, pain, confusion. She cleaned his wound with boiled herbs and warm water, whispered reassurances he couldn't understand, and did her best not to cry when he flinched from her touch. "You're safe now," she whispered. "No one's going to hurt you here." By nightfall, he was breathing easier. He hadn't spoken a word she could understand, but his eyes watched her closely, carefully. She brought him soup. He didn't eat much, but he sipped the broth. When she turned to stoke the fire, she heard it. Tunkashila, a Lakota word. She didn't know it, but the way he whispered it, like a prayer, made her pause. She turned and gave him a small smile. "If you've got someone out there looking for you, I hope they're close." She didn't know then that someone was, and that by sunrise on the 3rd day, 50 Lakota warriors would be riding over the ridge behind her home. Eliza didn't sleep much those first 2 nights. The boy, she still didn't know his name, slept in fits, murmuring in a tongue she couldn't decipher. He never cried, not once, but in the quiet hours before dawn, he would clutch the edge of the quilt and tremble. On the 2nd evening, he pointed to her chest, then tapped his own and whispered, "Kia." She furrowed her brow. "Is that your name?" He shook his head, then whispered, slower this time, "Not mother." Eliza's breath caught. She nodded solemnly. "No, I'm not, but I'm here." He looked at her with eyes too old for his small face, and Eliza felt something deep stir inside her, an ache not of pity, but of recognition. Loss met loss, and somehow it made both feel lighter. That night, she stayed by the fire, her shotgun resting nearby, not for the boy, but for the world that might follow him. Because she knew, no child wanders wounded through ranch country without someone missing him. And if someone was missing him, they'd come looking. At dawn on the 3rd day, it happened. The first thing she heard was hooves, soft, rhythmic, purposeful. Then the distant sound of drums, slow, measured. Eliza stepped out onto the porch and squinted toward the eastern hills, and there they were, 50 riders, moving in silence except for the wind and the hoofbeats. Their horses were painted in red and white patterns. The riders wore feathers, furs, beads. They rode with dignity, like the land bent beneath them rather than resisted. At the front rode a man taller than the rest, his face lined with grief and strength, his black hair tied tightly, an axe at his side and a scar under one eye. Eliza felt her breath leave her body. He didn't need to shout. He didn't raise his weapon. He simply reined in his horse and stared at her with eyes that burned like the first sun over snow. Inside the cabin, the boy stirred. His voice rang out, weak but sharp with relief. "Taku!" The man dismounted before the rest even stopped. He strode toward the cabin with calm force. Eliza stood her ground, heart pounding. He reached the porch, stopped a few feet from her, and looked her in the eyes. Then in accented but clear English he said, "You have my son." The silence was heavier than the wind. Eliza nodded slowly. "He's inside. I tended his leg. He's alive." The man stared for another long moment. His jaw twitched. Then he gave a single, deliberate nod. "I am Matoska, his father." Eliza stepped aside and opened the door, and for the first time in 3 days, the boy smiled. Matoska entered the cabin like a storm held on a leash, his movements controlled, but his energy coiled tight beneath his skin. He crossed the wooden floor in 2 long strides and knelt by the boy's side. The child's eyes lit up. 8, he whispered, barely above breath. Matoska placed a hand gently on the boy's chest. His face, hardened from years of battle and hardship, softened into something few ever witnessed, a father's unguarded love. Eliza stood near the door, uncertain whether to speak, move, or simply disappear. Matoska leaned in, spoke to his son in Lakota, words quick and low. The boy responded softly, then glanced toward Eliza. The man followed his son's gaze and turned to her. He says, "You fed him, tended his leg, let him sleep." Eliza nodded once. He was alone. I couldn't ignore that. Matoska studied her. Not just her words, but her eyes, her stance, the stillness of her shoulders. He rose slowly. Many would have turned him out, or worse. She met his gaze. I'm not many. Outside, the warriors waited in formation, quiet as stone. Matoska stepped out onto the porch and raised a hand. A single motion. The line of riders relaxed, but none dismounted. Eliza followed him out, her arms folded. You can take him home, she said. He's strong, healing. Matoska nodded. Yes, but he is not the only one who needs to heal. She blinked at that. He added, voice quieter now. When he speaks of you, his eyes do not carry fear. Eliza hesitated. I don't want anything from you, she said. No reward, no favors. Then what do you want? It took her a moment to answer. Finally, she said, to know he'll be safe, that's all. Matoska looked out toward the horizon. He wandered chasing a hawk. It flew too far from the ridge. He fell. Was lost. I feared he was taken by white men with hatred in their hands. Eliza's chest tightened. Some are like that, but not all of us. He looked at her again, and this time something in his expression shifted, from defense to curiosity. No, he agreed, not all. They returned inside. The boy was sitting up now, sipping warm broth. He grinned when his father sat beside him. Matoska placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder as she passed with another bowl of stew. It startled her, not because of fear, because of the gentleness in it. You are not invisible, he said quietly. The words struck deeper than she expected, and when he left that night, after promising to return in the morning with supplies and blankets to carry his son home, he paused on the porch. Will you still be here? Eliza gave the faintest smile. I've got nowhere else to be. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded, mounted his horse, and rode into the moonlight, 50 shadows trailing behind him. But Eliza felt, for the first time in years, a part of her had stayed with someone, and someone had stayed with her. Matoska returned at dawn, just as he said he would, but this time he rode alone. Eliza stood on the porch, wrapped in her old wool shawl, a cup of coffee in her hands. The boy still slept inside, his breathing steady now, his skin warmer. The fever had passed, and the worst of the wound was healing. As Matoska dismounted, Eliza felt something unfamiliar ripple through her chest. Expectation, not fear, not dread. Something gentler. Morning, she said, her voice gravelly from sleep. He nodded. You keep your promises, she added. He smiled, just slightly. So do you. They sat outside together as the sun rose over the pines. Matoska passed her a pouch of dried herbs, strong and bitter-smelling. For his leg. Keeps the poison from coming back. Thank you, she said, accepting it with care. After a long pause, she added, He told me his name last night, Wichitemni. He said it means to walk against the wind. Matoska chuckled softly. He earned that name the day he learned to run. Eliza smiled, stirring her coffee. He's brave and stubborn. He takes after his mother. That silence after the word mother was heavy. Eliza waited. Matoska continued, his tone lower now. She passed 2 winters ago. Fever came too fast. Took too much. Eliza bowed her head. I'm sorry. He nodded, but didn't look away from the horizon. Since then it's been me and him, and the wind. They were quiet again, but not uncomfortably. Later that morning, Matoska helped prepare a travel sling to carry the boy more comfortably. Eliza showed him how to adjust the strap she'd sewn from her old blanket. They worked side by side, and for the first time, he laughed. Not a loud sound, but a real one, when she scolded him for pulling the stitching too tight. You have the hands of a warrior, she teased, but the patience of a stampeding bull. He raised an eyebrow. And you? You speak like a woman who hasn't had company in too long. She laughed then, a full laugh. She didn't even remember the last time she had. When the sun reached its highest point, they ate together beneath the cottonwood tree behind her cabin. The boy napped in the shade nearby. Eliza turned to Matoska. "When you leave, will you come back?" She didn't mean to ask it aloud, but she didn't take it back either. Matoska looked at her, eyes steady and calm. "Would you want me to?" She nodded slowly. "I think I would." He reached across and gently touched her hand, calloused against his own. "Then I will." And though he left that afternoon, with his son safe across his chest and the prairie stretching before him, he left the fire burning in her hearth, because she knew now some goodbyes were only the start of something softer. A week passed, then another. Eliza went back to her routine, tending the chickens, patching the roof, mending fences after a windstorm. She told herself not to look east every morning, but she did, and every evening she left a small fire in the hearth just a little longer than she used to, just in case. It wasn't just hope, it was a promise, quietly kept. One crisp morning, as she gathered eggs from the coop, her mare lifted her head and snorted toward the hills. Eliza followed her gaze. There, at the top of the ridge, outlined against the soft orange sky, was a lone rider. Tall, broad-shouldered, still as stone, her breath caught. But she didn't run to him. She finished collecting the eggs, calm, measured. Then she wiped her hands, removed her apron, and met him halfway. Matoska dismounted with a quiet smile. In his arms was something wrapped in tanned hide. "Wichitemni made this," he said, offering it. He said it was for the woman who made the wind feel warm. Eliza unfolded the gift. It was a small leather pouch, carefully stitched, with a feather sewn to the front, and beads in earthy reds and golds. Inside she found wild sage, a smooth stone, and a dried apple slice. She laughed through the tears. "Tell him I still don't know how to cook meat without burning it, but my apples are famous 2 valleys over." Matoska chuckled. "He already told me, twice." They stood there for a moment, not needing more than what was shared in silence. Then he spoke. "You have no husband?" She shook her head. "Not anymore. Not in years." "No children?" "We tried," she said softly. "But it wasn't meant to be. I guess the world had other plans." He studied her gently. "It still does." He stayed that night, not inside the cabin, but nearby, beneath the tree where he'd first eaten with her. They spoke of small things, of Wichitemni's recovery, of the village beyond the ridges, of life alone and the spaces it leaves behind. And as the stars blinked into the sky, Eliza poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them out. She handed him one, then sat beside him. "You know," she said, "when I was young, I thought I'd end up somewhere grand. But now I think peace is the most luxurious thing there is." Matoska nodded slowly. "Peace, and firelight with someone who keeps it lit for you." She glanced at him, and he added simply, "I've come back, not for thanks, but because the world grows smaller without you in it." Her hands trembled as she lifted her cup, and in the stillness between their breaths, Eliza felt a new life beginning, not loud or sudden, but like morning rising over land that finally felt like home again. Matoska didn't leave the next day, or the day after that. Instead, he helped Eliza repair the old gate that had been leaning for 2 seasons. He tended to her lame mare with a tenderness that surprised even her. They worked in quiet rhythm, often speaking little, but their silences weren't empty. They were full, safe. One morning, Eliza found him planting seeds in the lower field she hadn't touched in years. She stood with her hands on her hips, watching him work. "You planning to move in?" she teased. He looked up, the sun catching the edges of his face. "Only if the field lets me." She raised an eyebrow. "The field?" Matoska stood and brushed dirt from his palms. "Land is like people. It remembers who treats it well. If it welcomes you back, you stay." Eliza smiled, the kind that warmed more than just the mouth. "Well, I suppose it hasn't kicked you out yet." By early summer, Matoska had built a small shelter beside the barn. He didn't move into the house, not yet. There was a respect in the space between them, not out of fear, but of care. He never assumed. He never pushed. He stayed because she asked him to, and he came inside when she left the door open. One late afternoon, a letter arrived from a trader in town. Eliza rarely received mail anymore, but this one was signed by the sheriff. She sat on the porch, eyes scanning the words slowly. A settler had claimed to have seen a Lakota boy near her property. There were concerns, questions, talk of trespassing. Eliza crumpled the paper in her hands. Matoska noticed. What is it? Someone trying to measure a world they don't understand. He waited. They want to ask why your son was here, why I helped him. Matoska's voice was calm. And what will you tell them? She didn't hesitate. That I gave shelter to a child in need, and that I'd do it again. She looked up at him, eyes fierce. And if they ask more, they can come see the woman who's got a shovel and no patience for foolishness. Matoska grinned. I believe you. That night the fire burned low. Eliza stirred stew while Matoska set 2 bowls down. When they sat across from each other, she didn't just eat. She reached for his hand. No ceremony, no grand declarations, just her hand resting in his. And for the first time in a long life filled with loss and wind-blown silence, she didn't feel like a widow anymore. She felt like a woman who had let someone in. The rains came late that year. For days, the skies wept softly over the plains, soaking the earth and making everything feel slower, quieter. Eliza didn't mind. She liked the way the world paused in the rain, how the sound of drops on her cabin roof felt like the steady breath of something finally at rest. Matoska stayed through the storms. They split the chores. He chopped wood while she baked. He mended the saddle while she folded linens. They rarely spoke of the past. They didn't need to. But one evening, as thunder rumbled far in the hills, Matoska spoke her name. Not Miss McBride, not you, not woman, just softly. Eliza. It caught her off guard. She looked up from the pot she was stirring. His eyes met hers with a quiet gravity. You carry that name like a stone that's been warmed by the sun, he said. She chuckled, wiping her hands on her apron. I never thought it was much of a name. Then it was never said by someone who meant it. That night they shared stories by firelight. She told him about her husband, Thomas, a good man with kind eyes, taken too soon by a fever no doctor could stop. He told her about his wife, Anne Pewee, morning sun, a woman who laughed like water over rocks and fought harder than most men in the village. There was no jealousy between their stories, only understanding. 2 people who had both buried love and yet somehow still believed in what could grow again. The next morning, Matoska brought in bundles of wildflowers, fresh, tangled, and imperfect. He laid them gently on her porch table. They reminded me of your hair, he said. She laughed, touched but shy. Wild and out of place? He leaned close, his voice quiet and warm, free, and stubborn enough to bloom where no one thinks it should. Eliza pressed her hand to the flowers, their scent rich with earth and morning. She didn't say anything. But that evening, when she made stew, she used the fine bowls, the ones she hadn't touched since Thomas died. Not because Matoska asked, because he mattered. And some things, like real love, deserved ceremony, even in silence. As summer deepened, so did the bond between them. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't wrapped in flowers or stitched into grand speeches. It was in the way Matoska reached for the kettle first thing in the morning, or how Eliza always left a second cup cooling beside his seat on the porch. It was in the shared glance when clouds gathered, in the ease of working side by side without needing to fill the silence. And then one morning the boy returned, Vichitemni. He rode up on a chestnut pony, grinning ear to ear, taller and stronger than she remembered, his scar barely visible now. Eliza, he shouted. She hurried out, wiping her hands on her apron. The moment he hugged her, all her defenses dropped. Matoska followed a few steps behind, his eyes soft as he watched them. He begged to visit, he said. Wichitemni chimed in. I brought something. From his satchel he pulled out a small wooden carving, a hawk, wings outstretched. For you, because you let me fly again. Eliza's throat tightened. She blinked fast and took the figure with both hands. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll keep it near my heart. That evening, the 3 of them sat around the fire pit out back. Wichitemni asked questions about the chickens, the roof, the old apple tree near the barn. He talked about school, his new puppy, and how his cousins thought Eliza's bread must be magic. Matoska smiled more that night than she'd ever seen. Later, when the boy fell asleep curled near the embers, Eliza and Matoska walked the field together, the stars spilling silver overhead. They stopped near the cottonwood, where months earlier they had first shared a meal. Eliza looked up. You ever think about staying? He turned toward her slowly. Every day. She swallowed. Then why haven't you asked? Matoska took her hands gently in his voice as low as the wind through the grass. Because I was waiting for you to ask me. She held his gaze. Then I'm asking. His grip tightened, not with urgency, but certainty. Then I'm staying. The next morning, Matoska and Wichitemni didn't leave. They moved their horses into her lower pasture. They stacked wood behind the barn. They built a pen for goats that hadn't yet arrived. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't loud. It was home, growing slowly around them like something that had always been meant to root. And Eliza, she woke that day not to silence, not to memory, but to the sound of a boy laughing and a man tending fire. And she smiled because the fire inside her was still lit. And this time, she wasn't the only one keeping it alive. The days lengthened, the corn grew tall, and the land felt more alive than it had in years. Neighbors, once distant or wary, began to notice the changes at the McBride place. They stopped by more often, sometimes for eggs, sometimes just to watch Wichitemni ride his pony with unshakable joy. They didn't ask questions, and Eliza didn't offer explanations. She no longer felt like she had to explain anything. Her life was her own now, not something to justify, only something to live. One evening, while Matoska fixed a fence post with his sleeves rolled high, Eliza stood watching him from the porch. He looked up, sweat on his brow, and smiled that quiet smile that had come to feel like the warmest place she knew. "You planning to stand there forever?" he teased. "Just long enough to remember it," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Remember what?" "This," she said. "The sound of the wind, you, working, that boy in the barn singing off key, all of it." Matoska walked toward her, boots heavy in the grass, and took her hand. "You'll never need to remember it," he said gently, "because you're not going to lose it." She looked at him, eyes brimming with something soft, something still healing. "I used to live in the shadow of what I lost," she whispered. "Now, I live in the warmth of what I've found." That night, they sat together on the porch swing. Wichitemni curled on a blanket nearby with a pup napping at his side. Matoska held Eliza's hand beneath the stars, and for the first time, she let her head rest on his shoulder. "Do you ever think we were meant to find each other?" she asked. He thought for a moment before answering. "I think the world doesn't always give us what we want, but sometimes when we least expect it, it gives us what we were missing." She closed her eyes. "I was missing you." He leaned in, kissed her temple. "And I was missing the place to come home to." A breeze swept through the field then, cool, quiet, full of peace, and the woman who once thought her life had already ended, sat beside the man who helped her begin it again. Summer rolled gently into early fall. The leaves at the edges of the woods blushed gold. The air shifted, crisper in the mornings, soft with memory in the evenings. And yet, everything on Eliza's land felt more alive than ever. The garden overflowed. The fences held strong. The laughter of a boy and the soft footsteps of a man had become the rhythm of her days. But more than that, so had the feeling. The quiet, steady knowing she was loved, she was chosen, she was no longer alone. One morning, as the sun broke over the hills, Eliza stood barefoot on the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. She watched Matoska and Wichitemni walking the field together, heads bowed in shared thought. It struck her then, not as a sudden realization, but a soft truth that had been blooming quietly within her for months. This was her family, not by blood, not by name, but by something deeper, choice, love that was earned, offered, accepted. When they returned to the porch, Wichitemni handed her a bundle of wildflowers. They were scraggly and uneven, plucked with the enthusiasm of a child, but perfect in every way that mattered. "You like yellow," he said simply. Eliza crouched and hugged him close, burying her nose in his hair. "I do," she whispered. "I do very much." Matoska stood behind them, smiling. When Eliza rose, he offered his hand, not because she needed help, but because he always offered. She took it, as she always would. That night, beneath the stars and wrapped in wool blankets, they sat around the fire pit. Wichitemni had fallen asleep early, curled near the pup who never left his side. Matoska turned to her. "When I first saw you, I didn't trust you." Eliza smiled, sipping tea. "I didn't trust myself." He nodded. "But something told me. This woman carries sorrow, the way warriors carry shields, not to harm, but to survive." Her eyes welled, but she didn't look away. "And you carry love the way others carry pride," she said, quiet, but steady. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over the lines time had drawn. "If you'll have me, I'll stay not as a guest, not as a shadow, but as a man who wants to grow old with you." Her voice broke as she answered, "You already are." In the weeks that followed, they marked no wedding with fanfare, but every sunrise was a vow, every chore done together, a promise, every shared silence, a song. Eliza never changed her name, but one day, as they carved initials into a post near the barn, Matoska added 3 lines, E plus M plus W. Eliza Matoska Vichhitemni, a woman who opened her door, a boy who survived, and a man who came with 50 warriors, but stayed with only his heart.